All right, hello everybody. So I'm going to be discussing with you today how to maintain a productive electron microscopy facility in the face of COVID-19. Sorry, I'm trying to get the, okay, here we go. So first, acknowledgements. So I want to acknowledge my coworkers here because we all suffered through this together, and they were actually instrumental in developing a lot of the techniques that you're going to see later. And in particular, I want to acknowledge this gentleman, Andres Truco. And the other thing I'd like to point out is you can see me right here. And I am actually holding a banner you will see from 2019. So this was actually the last time we held an in-person annual open house at our facility before the COVID situation hit. So that's why I chose to use this picture of my coworkers. So this is where I work. And so I work for the research service centers of the College of Engineering, and we are housed in the nanoscale research facility. And so this is a full service microfabrication and characterization user facility. So we have a class 100 clean room, and then we have basically any kind of major characterization equipment that you could imagine. You know, any electron microscopes, X-ray diffraction, CTs, things like that. If you can name it, we probably have it. And so I am in charge of these 5 pieces of equipment. So 2 dual beam fibs and 3 TEMs. So before we start talking about, the role of COVID here, it can kind of take you through kind of a day in the life of an electron microscopist who works at a facility like this. So it kind of comes down to 3 things. So the first thing is maintenance. So, making sure the tools are running properly, making sure everything's working okay, that kind of stuff. And the next one is what's called service. So service is where user comes to me, has specimens that he or she wants imaged, but doesn't want to receive training on the microscope, him or herself. So you hire me to do it for you. In this case, you see the person driving the car for somebody else. And the other thing is training. So I actually train you to drive the machine yourself, okay? So really it's these 3 things, okay? Training or maintenance, service, and user training. So then if we travel back in time to St. Patrick's Day 2020, I remember this day very distinctly because I was giving a seminar for my facility that we as staff members are required to do, I think biannually. And this was actually the title of it here. And the reason I remember this very distinctly is that this was the last day I recall as things were being somewhat normal. Okay. And this was also the last time I gave an in-person presentation before TMS, actually, before COVID came, right, and turned the entire world upside down. Okay. So once COVID came, our lives kind of revolved around this app that some of us had maybe never heard of, which of course was Zoom, right? And so we're all familiar, with living our lives on Zoom and seeing things like this where, cats were getting in the camera frame and whatnot, okay? And so this was kind of our existence for weeks. And so at some point though, right, the discussion was reopening the facilities and, people coming back and using everything again, okay? So we were planning to reopen the facility, but there were some strings attached with doing this reopening, okay, because we had to do it safely, obviously. So the first one was wearing of masks. So initially we were required to wear masks at all times inside the facility. Then there were also occupancy limits to the rooms, okay, based on the square footage of the room, okay. And then the other issue was social distancing, right? You're supposed to maintain about 6 feet separation between you and other people, okay? So we had these 3 things that we had to work around as part of the reopening. So if you go back to my day-to-day existence, the maintenance issue, not really affected by this a whole lot, okay? Because that by and large didn't really involve interacting with other people. So where the constraints became an issue was when you had to interact with people. But if you look at the service and the training, these involve interaction with other people, okay? And so this is where the constraints kind of come into play, obviously, okay? So service and training became a lot more complicated when we had these restrictions we had to work through or work around. Okay, so obviously the mask issue, that's an inconvenience, but you know, there's no workaround, right? You have to wear a mask, okay? So the other two things, the room occupancy and the social distancing. So most of the, so as I stated previously, the occupancy limits were dictated by square footage of the room, okay? And so pretty much all of our microscope rooms had square footage that only gave us occupancy of one person at a time, okay? So we had that issue to contend with, right? We were only allowed one person at a time inside the microscope rooms. And then of course we have the other constraint, which is, you know, maintain 6 feet of separation. So then if you're working with somebody doing a service request, how can you be with that customer? Because usually you want the customer there with you when you're working on his or her samples. So you have these constraints here. And then obviously with training, right? How can you train somebody when you also have these constraints here? Okay, so if you look at an example of this, right? Because, you know, I'm a TEM guy at heart. So if you're trying to, for instance, train a user to load a TEM holder. Okay, so this involves very fine movements in the, you know, millimeter range, right? So you can imagine it's pretty much impossible, for instance, to not be in the same room and not be within 6 feet of the person to show this, okay, or to demonstrate this or train the person. So how do we work around room occupancy and social distancing requirements? Okay. So as far as the service requests are concerned, those were a little bit easier to deal with, okay? So the issue with social distancing, not really an issue, right? Because even if you can allow more than one person in the room, right, all you have to do is be 6 feet apart, okay? So then the person could be with you in the room while you're working on specimens. The bigger issue is the room occupancy, okay? Because you can only have one person in the room at a time, okay? So how do you not violate the occupancy limits? Okay, so we had to use technology to help us out. So the piece of technology that we worked with was called an A10 Mini Pro, and this is what it looks like, okay? So what you have here are a series of inputs here. Okay, these are HDMI inputs, and these come from the video cards from your instrument computers. And then you have a USB out that gets plugged into a laptop that is hosting a Zoom meeting. Okay, and then you can use this to screen capture what is on the microscope computer, and then the person just sees it on Zoom, right? So then that person can see what you're seeing in real time, but doesn't have to be in the same room as you, okay? So the basic flow process is this, right? Once you plug in the USB from the ATEM, okay, you boot up the camera app. There's this little button here which says use the rear facing camera. What that does then is it shows the signal coming from the microscope monitor. Okay, then you boot up Zoom, then you share the screen, right? And then the user sees what you're seeing on the instrument computer, and he or she doesn't have to be in the same room as you. Okay, that can be done from the comfort of the customer's home or office, per se. So that's how we got around or worked around the issues with the service requests. So the training is far more complicated, okay, because both of these issues come into play. So now one thing we were allowed to do, so we were allowed to, for brief periods of time, violate the occupancy restrictions, okay? And as far as the social distancing was concerned, we were allowed to violate that as well, provided that both of the people, meaning myself and the trainee, were both wearing surgical grade face masks, okay? So these were not, you know, ironclad rules per se. We were allowed to violate them briefly and in some instances for short periods of time, provided we had the correct PPE, okay? But that didn't mean that this wasn't still pretty complicated, okay? So again, we use technology to help us here, okay? So you can see kind of a typical setup that we used here to train a user while working around these restrictions. So we're seeing this demonstrated here with the dual beam fib, okay? So what you're seeing here is there's a camera right here that is focusing in on the stage of the microscope, and then that signal from the camera is being sent out into the hall to a monitor in the hallway, okay, where myself is here watching what the user is doing without actually being in the same room. Okay, there's also another monitor out here, which we'll get to in a second here. Okay, but so again, you have this camera, which allows you to look at the stage, and then that goes out into the monitor outside the room. Okay, so again, you can work around those restrictions. And as far as the other monitor is concerned, right, so you can mirror that display and then send that out to another monitor, again, in the hallway, okay? So same idea here, right? So using a 2-monitor setup here, and then sending those images or those video feeds, I should say, out into the hall, we can work around the room occupancy and social distancing restrictions. So one of the kind of comical things that came out of this was learning about cables. So I was actually fairly ignorant about this in the beginning. Okay, I really didn't understand this very well, but you'd be surprised how many different video card outputs and inputs there are, right? So these are just, some of them, right? You have this thing called mini DisplayPort to HDMI. You have a DVI to HDMI. This was actually rather typical on some of the older machines, okay? The DisplayPort, HDMI, those are kind of more modern instruments. Okay, and then we have regular DisplayPort to HDMI. So I was really ignorant about this and about graphics card ports. This was something I had to learn about when we were doing these things like plugging into the ATEM box and then sending these signals out into the monitors in the hallway. Okay, the other thing we did was we did a lot with training aids. So tutorials and demos that were put on YouTube. Some of these were in person, some of them weren't. So again, if they were in person or live, right, those were hosted via Zoom, again, using the ATEM for the screen capture, and then those could be screen shared via Zoom. So these obviously are not a training substitute, but they are useful as a complement to the training. Okay, so eventually, depending on where you live, this was different, but in the case of where our facility is in Florida, we eventually dropped all of these restraints. Okay, so we no longer have a mask mandate. We no longer have the same room occupancy constraints. I think there are still some limits on room occupancy, but they're no longer an issue with getting 2 people in the room at once. We no longer have social distancing constraints either. But were there permanent or remaining fallout from COVID? And the answer is yes. Okay, so one of the things that happened as a result of COVID was we just became far more safety conscious in general about users being in the facility, and particularly when they were working outside normal business hours, because we don't have anybody here in the facility outside of 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So one of the things we instituted was a buddy system, or an e-buddy system, where if you're working between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. During the week, or between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. on the weekends, you have to have an e-buddy who periodically checks in with you to make sure that you're okay and nothing has happened to you. Obviously, when this was suggested to me, I kind of comedically remarked, are we worried about like the TEM coming to life and eating somebody, right? Obviously, that's not going to happen. But again, it was just a heightened awareness of safety. The other thing as well was we put restrictions on hours, period. So we no longer allow any access from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. regardless. Before COVID hit, we were 24/7. You wanted to come in here at 11 p.m. at night on a Saturday, you could. Okay, but we no longer allow work between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. And the interesting thing is that we haven't actually seen any drop off in terms of the hours of usage. So people have just kind of learned to adapt to the restrictions. Okay, so we had access restrictions, and we also have the 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Restrictions, and then we also had an e-buddy required for after hours work. I apologize, this should say 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. here. Okay, so just as a summary, okay, COVID came along and we had to get creative, right? We had to get creative to, keep doing what we needed to do. Okay, so we made use of technology primarily, right? You see the A10 Mini Pro. We had to learn about cables, okay? We used this fancy setup here where we took signals from either cameras or the monitors and then put them into the hallway so we could be with the user while not being in the same room or violating social distancing. Okay, we also made use of Zoom and YouTube as well. So the latter case for, hosting things like training aids. Okay, and then we also have the hour restrictions and the implemented eBuddy system that likely will be a permanent change for COVID. So shameless plug here. I was actually contacted about giving this presentation via one of the symposium organizers who found my YouTube channel. So I do maintain a YouTube channel. It's just, my name here if you want to find it. And it is dedicated exclusively to electron microscopy. So I have tutorials, demos, and more. So if you're interested or you want to learn more about electron microscopy specifically, please go ahead and find me there if you're interested. And with that, I thank you for your attention.